Our next speaker is architect Kapil Gupta from Serie Architects. Kapil Gupta is the co-founder of Serie Architects and principal of Serie Mumbai. He graduated with honors from Sir J.J. School of Architecture in 1996, Mumbai, followed by postgraduate studies at the Architectural Association in London. He was a director at the Urban Design Research Institute, Mumbai, between 2003 and 2008, where he led India's first entry to the Venice Architecture Biennale in 2006. He has served as a visiting critic at numerous schools in India and been on several jury panels for competitions and design awards, including Archipri in 2010. He was the Charles Correa Design Chair at the Goa School of Architecture for 2020 and a design reviewer for the 2022 cycle of the Aga Khan Award for Architecture. Kapil leads and manages Serie's project portfolio in India with projects ranging across housing, commercial, and institutional sectors. He's closely involved with the development of projects from inception to completion. He has written on the challenges of South Asian urbanization and is currently involved with ecological and land regeneration strategies in India as a response to climate change. I would like to invite architect Kapil Gupta on stage to share with us his presentation.
It's a pleasure to be here, and I thank IIA Chennai for inviting me. I'm going to show you all a range of projects that the office has been working on. I don't do these lectures too often because, it just takes so long to build. So I often end up showing the same work kind of iteratively again. But I guess in a sense, today I will focus on, probably a lot more of the work that we're doing in India and, some of our work that has been finished in Singapore. I think also just with the view to, in a way, engage a lot of the students that I see in the audience today. Okay, so this is just a photo of me and Chris at one of our longest standing sites. It's almost around 12 years. We founded Serie Architects, me and Christopher, in 2006, and we've been working together ever since. I guess what's kind of interesting is that both Chris and I, we come from very different backgrounds and histories. He is Chinese Malay, now settled in London, educated in Malaysia, Singapore, and in London, which is where we actually met. While I live across Bombay and Goa and was educated in London as well. So with offices and sites across Europe and Asia, we're neither a global office offering institutionalized, technologically advanced and often non-contextual expertise, and neither are we a regional practice with a privileged access to local knowledge. So how could we then establish a common framework of practice that relies fundamentally on the disciplinary knowledge within architecture to create contextual and meaningful work? So what do we seek? We seek an architecture of meaningful difference that is drawn from the transformation of persistent types, which are found both in historically exceptional and common buildings that reside within a city and place. And in a certain sense, there's a kind of homage to Rossi, so to speak. And Rossi spoke about these persistent types as these kind of urban artifacts, condensers of a memory, experience, and the shared history of a city or a place. Our work hence investigates the deep structure of these types and reframes them within new solutions to create an architecture that is both contextually meaningful and inventively different. And so essentially when we're talking about persistent architecture, what are we, in a sense, kind of, let's say, referring to? So on this slide here, you can see, both pre-colonial architecture, you can see colonial architecture, you can see architecture that's, this is a part of our shared history, at least in this part of the world. But this is a way of looking, and it is not necessarily focused on India. In a certain sense, it's that same gaze when we talk about histories, which could be contemporary histories, modern histories. But the idea of persistence is something which finally resides, within the lived experience of a certain society or of a society where the actual projects are. So in every project that I will basically present, I'll try to reason through how we arrived at the design, at the form, and of course the kind of challenges of maybe building what we have. So I will start the presentation with this 250-acre site master plan for a new ashram called the Srimad Rajchandra Mission. So this is a modern Jain ashram, and we won this competition around 2010, and it's been around 12 years. And this was the site that we were actually presented with, which was completely deforested. Being Jains, they refused to stop the Adivasis from actually coming in and deforesting the entire site, because they knew they needed the firewood. So the grand vision, of course, for the actual master plan kind of unfolded and continues to unfold with, of course, housing, institutional program, and other shared community facilities. And I will, of course, be talking primarily about two structures. One is the Satsang Hall, which is probably the most challenging building that we've done so far in India, and some of the housing works, just as a way to begin to reframe, how do you really contextualize, work, especially when you're working with, what Rahul Mehrotra interestingly calls a faith-based architecture. So this is a kind of visualization of this highly contoured site, which is about almost 150 meters in terms of elevation. At the peak of the site is, at the highest point, is a Jain temple that has been recently completed. And you see this kind of cone-like shape at the back. So this is just an earlier, one of the earlier options. And we probably went through 15 options with the client over a year. Because I guess it's kind of interesting to talk about this, because so much of this is also woven into this well-worn discourse around, identity. And I guess especially within post-colonial societies, this is somehow exacerbated. So every option was either too Islamic, or it was too Buddhist, or it was too, and in a certain sense, this aspect of form finding, became almost central to them. The symbolism of a lotus, or and all of these metaphors didn't really allow us to arrive at something that was truly unique in that sense, right? To that site, to that location, to this very modern Jain sect, who had these grand aspirations of having this large meditation space. This is, of course, what finally emerged. This is the building. This is the main satsang hall. It has a large auditorium which can seat about 5,000 people within it. Of course, there are classrooms, there's a museum, and there are other contemplative spaces which are all stacked and kind of tiered one above the other. But this family of forms, this kind of tiered structure, in a certain sense borrows really from a mythical structure, the Jain Samavasaran, which is the image on the actual left-hand side, which is a tiered pyramidal form, where animals, humans, and demigods, are engaged in basically divine communion. And the idea of the Samavasaran was something that is very precious, within kind of Jain mythology. So in a certain sense, a mythical building, in a sense, kind of drove the broad massing and the ideas that we had around the satsang hall. And you can see that in the actual section. If you begin to interrogate a little further, a little deeper into even the origins of kind of, Hindu architecture and basically Hindu temple building, it's kind of interesting because it's about repetition in scale, where the smallest audicule, so to speak, which you see, on the corner right, is multiplied over and over and over again, as you see in a series of the kind of diagrams, from very simple organizations to highly complex shikharas. So the plan itself of a Hindu temple has a kind of fractal nature, where depending upon the aspirations of the patron, the Sompuras, who are the kind of traditional architects, kind of knew how to regulate geometry through scalar repetition to kind of create kind of grand monuments. I mean, ours is of course, significantly humbler. And, within our project as well, we saw a kind of move from a family of around 9 blocks to around 13 blocks. We even had versions where we had 16 and maybe around 19 blocks. But we finally settled, on the actual 13 block plan. And as you can see in the actual design. So what you have is this family of forms where these gently curved marble-clad volumes finally terminate on this kind of lantern at the top, which has which has one of the meditation halls there. And the plan itself, as you can see, is almost kind of a mandala-like. I mean, unfortunately, the lines aren't very clear, but the circle in the center is about 60 meters in diameter, and that is the main meditation space, which can house about 5,000 people, with one balcony. And you have along the cardinal directions is where you have the primary entrances also on, along the northwest, the northeast, southwest, southeast corners, and you kind of end up with this formation, which is absolutely clear, in the plan of the ground floor. This is just a view of, the kind of entrance, and you can see in a certain sense how the geometries of the buildings begin to actually coincide on the ground floor. So as you begin to build it up, unlike a typical auditorium, there is the guru, Rakesh Bhai, and the 5,000-seater is built around fundamentally his discourse. So that really becomes, in a certain sense, the seat of the entire building. Now, how do we span 60 meters? And this is where we had this, very interesting structural solution, where we had 4 intersecting arches, and these arches intersect in a way where they actually cut the span, but the square that is formed in the center is what the lantern is actually supported on. So you have these 4 main circulation cores on the 4 corners, and that is the entire ground floor when you actually slice it at that level. So you get these large kind of, let's say, double height spaces, and the geometry of the circles that we have on the outside then becomes a persistent element, which is repeated, whether it's the flooring or the ceiling, but then through that kind of scalar repetition, we begin to create certain harmonies of elements within the building itself. But this is what the meditation hall will actually look like when it is finished, seating 5,000 people. And you can really see the arches, within the building itself, as in are left absolutely bare, whereas everything else, of course, requires a lot of acoustic works, because of the acoustic requirements of the building itself. So as we begin to move up, this is the balcony level, then you have an actual museum. And above this, the plan shifts, it actually rotates. And this is where you have the main meditation hall with other contemplative spaces and classrooms, surrounding the kind of primary building in the actual center. That is the actual lantern level, so that's around 20 meters. It's a fairly large kind of volume that is the crown of the building itself. This is another visualization of this. This is all going to be built up in basically fabric as a way to have the acoustic qualities of an extremely tall space, but also in a certain sense create a very serene environment. This is not working, unfortunately. This is an actual section that gives you a sense of the overall, the spaces, as well as the geometries of the arches and how they hold up the larger lantern at the upper level. So these are some of the construction shots of the actual building. This is moved on from here now, but you can see the building is about 120 meters by 120 meters. So it's a fairly large structure that's being built in basically Dharampur. And fundamentally what you have is a series of large concrete shear walls. The entire building is in fact concrete shear wall, which was actually the most effective way to have the spans that we essentially required around the auditorium space as well. Initially, of course, we wanted to just leave the building exposed in kind of concrete, but the clients had other ideas in mind, and they insisted that we begin to use the same materials that have been used in the Jain temple. So thence became this entire exercise of finding craftspeople to actually work with us on the exterior facade. These are some kind of construction shots of the interior. We've just started the interior fit out, and we hope to have this ready by the end of the year. But you can see the intersection of the arches, and the geometry of the arches is also where they're not perfectly straight, but they're actually curved, like the gentle curves that you see on the facade of the building. So this is where it is at right now. We've just started with the construction of the lantern at the apex of the building, at the apex of this family of farms. And this is the marble cladding. So we didn't want to be wasteful. So we essentially got waste marble from Makrana, and we basically hacked them into these 40 thick bricks. And we've got 15,000 square feet, or rather square meters of cladding. And it was just exceptional because, it's just all the kadiyas, the masons that we worked with were just phenomenal. And, this is all hand-laid. All of this has been hand-laid. And it's been a real kind of, let's say, a real labor of love. But it's quite exceptional in terms of the work that they did. In fact, it's kind of interesting because I was quite worried about the corner. But it's just this a knuckle joint in a certain sense, right? Where you hack the marble and, you rely on the concrete to finally give you a fairly precise edge. But it's actually when you get close to the building, you can kind of see that kind of quality of the actual hacked marble. So we hope to finish this project, hopefully by the end of this year. And it'll be completely ready with all the fit outs around March next year. So yes, this is the ashram project. Moving forward, of course, I'm only showing you some of the housing because it was kind of interesting again, both as a kind of anecdote, but also in a certain sense that, how do you really begin to take often, ideas that are esoteric and actually begin to use them to your advantage. And the client for the housing was very keen that the housing would be Vastu compliant. Now, simply given that we had very steep slopes to actually contend with, it was almost impossible for the housing to be placed along cardinal directions or to get the entries where you wanted them from the east, etc. But what was useful is when we began to see the Vastu diagram in a certain sense as an enabler of the architecture itself. So by simply rotating the diagram of the 9-square grid on a diagonal and creating those as basically levels and allowing them to step down along the slopes, essentially created large shared balconies. And that in a certain sense became the primary conceit of the project. So it allowed for 2-bedroom, 3-bedroom, 1-bedroom, a whole variation of types of apartments. And this just shows you a kind of build-up of how the housing kind of emerged from different levels where the core would basically shift from the front to the back and accommodate the slopes and minimize the amount of, let's say, cut and fill that we had to actually do. So you kind of end up with this very nice form which kind of cascades along the slopes with these large terracotta screens that provide privacy from one apartment to the next. At the same time, sometimes actually being lifted up on stilts to accommodate some of the steeper slopes on the site itself. But what's interesting again is that, it would be almost impossible to build this as a commercial project because these balconies are shared across apartments. And I think that's what makes it kind of interesting, that this idea of sociality, the idea that you have these shared spaces that are offered by the architecture, and these become in a certain sense places where people actually get together and hang out. And this was some of the earlier images of the project under construction, but they're these very large expansive spaces, and you can actually see almost 3 levels up, and there is this kind of camaraderie that you see within people who are occupying the same building. This is one of our older projects, but I often show this simply because it's also demonstrates in a certain sense, I think some of the key ideas that drive the work at Serie. So this is the tote. In 2008, we were actually given a series of disused buildings in the Mahalakshmi Racecourse. And if you all know the Mahalakshmi Racecourse, again, it's another colonial vestige. And they have a lot of these old administrative blocks that they wanted to refurbish and begin to lease them out to people to create a new program. So the tote, as we now call it, was essentially is a series of banquet halls, a restaurant, a bar, basically F&B and hospitality facilities. Now, Because it was a heritage grade 2B location, there were certain limitations in terms of what we could do. We couldn't erase the building and rebuild something completely modern. We had to remain within the conservation envelope, which essentially means that we needed the gable roofs. At that height, we had to maintain the arch terracotta, but over and above that, we were given whatever freedoms we kind of needed. But what was interesting for us, of course, was that when you begin to look at this site, it's incredible because it's completely covered by these magnificent rain trees. And the canopy of the rain trees almost begins to inscribe, in a sense, a kind of interiorized space. So the idea that rather than just looking at the volume as something that is separate from the site itself, could we almost imagine the building itself, the interior of the new building, of the new program, to feel like a seamless extension of the trees from the outside into the inside. But at the same time, it became an opportunity for us to revalidate or reimagine the offerings, so to speak, of colonial architecture and its grammar. So these are, in fact, the actual metal trusses that you see at at Victoria Terminus Station. And they're exquisite, and you actually see so much of them across a lot of the transport infrastructure in India. But again, these are spaces that are constantly visited by people, and in a certain sense for us, are kind of embedded within our collective unconscious. And in a certain sense, the structure hence for the new building emerged from both this imagination of the trees as being extended into the volume, but also the ability to take a colonial artifact and transform it, within the envelope, within this new envelope. So these are just some of the diagrams which could essentially show the kind of iterations and the iterative development of this kind of branching structure. So what you essentially have is a steel column which begins to branch outward into eight branches, which then which actually interconnect, and then begin to spread outward as a kind of filigree pattern onto the ceiling, almost calling on that quality of, let's say, dappling that you would see or that you feel under the canopy of the rain trees outside. So this entire building was built completely in steel, and these are some of the images of the project as it was completed. So it's an incredibly transparent building. This is just the ceiling plan. There's a very intricate kind of drawing of the entire false ceiling. But you begin to really sense this kind of transparency, almost as if you are looking through a kind of grove of trees. But these are, in fact, the metal trusses that hold up the entire roof. And this is the actual banquet halls that you have that are used for weddings and a lot of industry events, etc. It's essentially made out of webs that have been laser cut, where the flanges have been welded on, and all of the glazing elements were then kind of customized. Again, this aspect of transparency, the building, you can see through it all the way to the rain trees on the outside. So that aspect of this continuity of the experience of the trees is something that is drawn into the building, is actually felt in the design itself. Just some more photos of the pre-function spaces. Some of the details. This is the lounge areas on the outside, and the building in the evenings. It's actually very pleasant. We've got a minimal amount of lighting because the building itself illuminates the outside. So this is a project that was completed a couple of years ago. This is the new School of Design and Environment at NUS in Singapore. And we won the competition about 5 years ago, and the building was finished about 2 years ago, quite recently. And we were given this very beautiful site, which is on the apex of this hill in the NUS campus. And, essentially, how do you begin to think about, tropicality and kind of tropical architecture? And the dean of the school was also very keen that this project should be Singapore's first net zero energy project. And that was fantastic because, it really allowed us to look both at basically passive design, but have a incredibly articulate and a very precise diagnostic on how we could actually achieve this. And the office also partnered with Dr. Wolfgang Kessling from TransSolar, who did all of the important solar studies and helped us work through this aspect of, how do you begin to reduce your energy consumption, reduce energy loads. And in a certain sense, again, going back to a kind of historical type, you're looking at the Malay House, which is very interesting because it's a building that's raised on stilts, which fundamentally promotes cross-ventilation through it, through very, very thin screens. And in a sense, the building, in a sense, draws on kind of similar ideas. So rather than just a large air-conditioned box, we're looking at a kind of grammar of platforms and programmatic boxes that are placed on the platforms as a way to organize the program of the school. There's a large roof on the top, which is essentially one large solar array. And that pretty much drives the energy demands for the school. What it also does, it becomes a shading system. So what you have is this oversailing roof, which shades on the north and the south fundamentally, all of the primary classrooms, the gathering spaces, and all of the other facilities of the school itself. But I think what's visible even in the model is this kind of deep porosity that you have through the building, calling on again, the idea of the actual Malay House. Where we also kind of moved away was, in a certain sense, education so much today is about peer-to-peer learning. So this idea that you could actually have spaces where students could actually have chance meetings, amongst themselves, with basically faculty. So we created a large social platform, which we call like the living room of the house. And this is really where, students arrive, before they move up and down to their, their classrooms. And, that is this kind of large community space. We've also have these curtains to be able to be drawn every time you have a lot of rain, so that you have some rain protection. This is the array that we have of the photovoltaics on the entire ceiling. And you can see, how we've taken those staircases and actually carved them back into the hill to lead you up to the kind of highermost level. So this, as you can see, is the entire elevation. So we have an enormous amount of glass, but thanks to the large oversailing roof, it provides enough, cuts away direct light, but allows enough light into the classrooms, which we also have by the actual fins that we have above on all of the elevations. So you get all the light you need, but you get no glare. And it's a very, very pleasant space to actually be in. Just some of the early, early renders of the crit space. So the crit space is another interesting room because it actually drops down from the ceiling, and that's where students make their presentations. And in a certain sense, that's kind of something which is normally behind closed doors and closed away or other shut away, at least becomes a kind of visible part of the architecture of the building itself. Also, we've all of the 5 years, the students from the first to the 5th year share one common studio. Again, the idea that you can have this kind of space of peer-to-peer learning and, essentially promotes a lot more cross-collaboration between various faculties and the students themselves. This is the graduate school, which is, essentially one level up. And, just the overall rendering of the building. This is the project as it was finished. The east and the west face have these very fine perforated an aluminum screen to essentially cut away all the heat gain on the east and the west facades. Now, because this is the School of Design and Environment, these panels are actually removable, which allows students to also experiment and to test, various ways in which they can deal with basic, with the facade as an environmental or as a climatic barrier. Again, just a view of the large living room of the school. Completely lush. We actually managed to transplant some very, very mature rain trees, which was quite amazing. But again, the corridors, the movement spaces, that kind of informality that the school actually is about, the visibility through the porosities, both to light and air, but also, visual connections between various levels. And it's a really fun school, and every time I've actually been there with Chris, we've been there for a couple of crits as well. And it's just a really, really nice space. This is the aluminum screen again. This is one of the rain trees that was transplanted on site, and another view of the entire crit space. So in terms of the cooling strategies, essentially what you are doing is you're looking at sensate cooling. And that works, fabulously in the tropics. We know this so well because we all have ceiling fans. So essentially what you're doing is you're trying to wick away the moisture by air movement around the human body. So you don't need to cool the building to 21 degrees Celsius, but at about 25, if it's 30 degrees outside and you're at around 25 degrees inside, but with the fans on, it's a very, very pleasant temperature to be. So these were the kind of strategies that were employed by Wolfgang as a way to begin to drop the energy load of the building. So the air conditioning system, as we know, works at about 35% in terms of capacity as a business as usual model. And I think that is what really allowed us to have this as a net zero energy building. This is, of course, the green spaces that we have on the upper level where you have the graduate school. And these are the screens. These are actually removable. You can actually move them out. The next project was actually a kind of competition project. This is in the iconic Mehrangarh Fort. And we were called in to design a new knowledge center and a new visitor center. It's probably one of the most visited monuments in India. And the king, so to speak, who still runs the foundation and the museum, they needed a new knowledge center where they do a lot of restoration and conservation work for a lot of the havelis and a lot of the old forts and palaces that you have in Rajasthan. So that was one aspect of the knowledge center, but the other was also to put on to display how restoration happens. And here the site itself, as you can see, the building, the pointer doesn't work unfortunately, but the actual building, as you can see in the foreground, is just kind of peeping out. So the site was a 30 by 30 meter pit, which was around 10 meters in. So the building was completely embedded within this large pit. And in a certain sense, they were very clear that they didn't want the buildings had to completely blend with the architecture of the fort, and they didn't want anything that was dramatically different. So in a certain sense, there were three challenges. How do you optimize the potential of this high-walled site, kind of 10 meters around you? Right at the base of the site, behind that large wall, is this beautiful bagh, which is called the Chokela Bagh. And of course, all of the typical requirements, or rather the actual wish list that somehow we sample, traditional Rajasthani architecture. So fundamentally, just a couple of very simple strategies. One was we placed the entire program as a cube, within the actual walled space, and we rotated at 45 degrees. And that simple rotation created a series of pools, and that's how we kind of treated the ground. These reflective pools as a way to just create, cool contemplative spaces at the lowest level, which is really accessible largely only to the restoration teams and the conservationists. So just these very contemplative spaces behind these large walls. But the other big move was to open up a path from the highest level at the terrace all the way down to the garden at which is almost a drop of about around 12 meters. So we slice the actual staircase on a diagonal across the entire cuboid. And in a certain sense, we kind of again draw on the history of all the stepped wells that you see in this region and in Gujarat as well. And what you hence kind of end up with is this kind of visual connection between the kind of pavilion at the upper level and the garden at the actual lower level. And you get this very simple plan, but it also creates this very nice viewing deck, which people can actually walk out or can walk up onto and enjoy the views of the garden and all the surrounds. And this is that staircase, as you can see. So, it's almost like walking through one of those narrow streets in Rajasthan, but this time you have these large windows, which also gives people a kind of visual connection to all the activities that are kind of happening within the knowledge center. Again, this just shows you the resolution of the entire ground plane. For the design of the visitor center, so again, as you can see in the foreground is this kind of gently cascading a series of volumes. Now, typically, when you go to a visitor center at Mehrangarh Fort, you have to queue up, and these queues are monotonous and they're boring, and you're just waiting outside. Also, it's a very steep terrain, and you kind of have to negotiate, almost moving about 15 meters up, like it's climbing almost around 4 to 5 stories. And the other is, of course, beautiful landscape, this kind of desert brush that you have all around. And how do we kind of connect the actual knowledge center rather than being a kind of insulated box, and how do you make those connections outside? So rather than just putting everything into one large volume, which is what they imagined we would end up doing, we essentially broke down security, baggage, information center, or the ticketing and the audio guide collection spaces as a series of individual kind of volumes, which then could be actually linked up to allow people to move sequentially between kind of one to the other. So this notion of room-to-room movement is again something that we've always seen in traditional architecture in India. And then in a certain sense, you begin to slice away parts of the program that you don't need to create these kind of, or these terraced gardens, right? And then the cascading of the building itself to allow people, to move from kind of one level to the next. So then by simply moving the program, or rather every volume by a meter or so, we actually managed to create, in a certain sense, a sequence of movement that is, there's something, it's not showing up on my screen. Yep. Yeah. So you have these kind of sequence of rooms of these gently ascending pavilions, which then finally brings you up all the way to Jaipur Plaza, where you get this phenomenal view again of the city all around. So again, here you essentially have a kind of architecture that is very innocuous, makes movement through all the various stages of the visitor center until you kind of come up to the entrance of the. So again, this idea that you work with geometry, you work with the deep structure of certain types that are at your disposal, but you can do something that is kind of contextually relevant in terms of material. But the architecture is, of course, something that's in a certain sense stands apart. This next project has been unfortunately under construction for almost 8 years. It's been stalled for about 3 years, but it's still a very exciting one. This was when we were called in to build a hotel. They're not very large, around 32 rooms on a 60-acre parcel on this absolutely incredibly beautiful site, on coastal Maharashtra. And, it almost seemed like a shame to build anything that would destroy, in a sense, this kind of very, very natural landscape. So if you look at a typical hotel model, it's either a kind of hub and spoke arrangement with a main restaurant, or rather with the main hotel room, and then either you've got the kind of cottages that are then dotted into the landscape, or you have one large building, with corridors leading to rooms. And we didn't want to, in a certain sense, use either of these. So how could we, in a sense, create a kind of architecture that disappears into the landscape, where it's almost invisible? And this is really where we began to think about the forts, the fortifications of Maharashtra. So starting all the way down from, from the Malvan area, going all the way up north, Raigad, Murud Janjira, you have these fortifications on these hills that were a part of the entire Maratha kind of empire. And what's amazing about these fortifications is how architecture begins to articulate to the shape and the contours of these hills. So in a certain sense, they minimize basically cut and fill because they accommodate to the terrain. And in a sense, the modulation of the walls is also, in a certain sense, something that is drawn, from the landscape. So that's essentially what we began to do, was to think about the entire hotel as a fort, or as the wall of a fort. So phase one would be a 250-meter long building, only 20 meters wide. But in phase two, phase three, it would expand along the edges of the cliff wall almost like an actual fortification. So what you have is this very long, slender building which is perforated with courtyards, as you all can see, and this sinusoidal curve which is reflected in the roof, which in a sense divides all the private spaces of the hotel rooms and all the public spaces that lie behind. So the public spaces are light gray and the rooms are, essentially in dark gray. The courtyards, of course, bring light, deep into the building. So you really have this kind of an actual landform that basically disappears, almost merges with the ground on either side and allows the landscape to actually come over and, take over the roof. So when this is like, what we call the kind of deep structure diagram, which just shows you the modulations of the form, on the inside. And this also shows how the building actually begins to dip around 6 meters, again taking on the natural contour, minimizing cut and fill, to kind of create this kind of very sinusoidal, very, very linear architecture. So what's interesting is that when you drive up to this building, you don't know what it is because you don't see windows, you don't see, it doesn't look like a hotel, not entirely sure what it is. Whereas when you enter through that gap, between these large walls, is where there is that moment of expansion and you're looking through the main, like the main hotel lobby, the living space, to these amazing views that you have beyond of the hills and of course the entire bay and the estuary, at the mouth of the river. This is of course from the seaside, some of the pool views, the rooms, and of course that's the overall, plan of the building. And the roof was, a real challenge because we of course wanted to build it all in concrete, but it's in an incredibly exposed location. And the monsoons, I mean, just the brunt of the monsoons on the southwest, which is the back, would just be intense. And we were almost sure that, the concrete would leak. So we finally went ahead, with the essentially zinc on the main sinusoidal curve, which we felt was the one that was most exposed. So these are some of the images of the project where it is right now. You can see how it just appears to be something that's been built into the landscape itself. Here is the other, as you approach, this is the large walls, the undulating walls with the curved concrete beams that take on this kind of shape. And, inshallah, sometime next year they will finish this project. This is, of course, on the seaside. Again, just views of this building as it kind of hugs the ground. These large voids, where you have the pools, etc. But that's, really in a sense my favorite photograph. Where the geometry of the building itself actually completes, in a certain sense, the form of the hill. This is the other large project that was recently finished in 2020, the new subordinate courthouse complex in Singapore. It's a project that we won in competition in 2011. Just some of the earlier renderings. What was very interesting over here, of course, is that the entire program is almost about 150,000 square meters. And how does one begin to design a vertical courthouse? I mean, a typical courthouse would be a horizontal, a kind of ground straddling organization. And now we actually flip that up to kind of create this tall tower. So in a certain sense, how do you begin to think about this? So again, what's kind of interesting when you begin to look at the two persistent types in Singapore, one is of course the high-rise, right? It's the home of the high-rise. And the other is again a part of its own colonial history with these beautiful old shop houses, which are now under conservation and represent a very important part of Singapore's colonial history. The project itself essentially calls on three important questions. How do you create effective court process? Because you need to move people, you need to move judges and the accused in a highly complex vertical organization in terms of movement. How does the building become some kind of a compelling representation of justice? And how does it establish any kind of relationship to the fabric of the city, which is basically Singapore? So essentially what we did was, rather than a single tower we split the building into two towers. The grey mass is where all the offices of the judges are, and the pink mass is where we have all the courtrooms. And the two are connected by a series of bridges. And these bridges allow the actual judges to walk directly into their courtrooms. And in a certain sense, being conscious of this fact that, the government was, of course, interested in minimizing, energy demand on a project that large, we actually stripped away the elevation. The transparency of the building, almost a metaphor for the judicial system. The pink boxes, of course, would be air conditioned, but everything else would not. And again, it draws from the idea of these actual terracotta roofs, and that is what all of the kind of courtrooms are clad in. This kind of customized terracotta panels that we designed to kind of animate the facades of of the building. So every floor itself, this idea of a shared collective platform rather than rooms being placed, cheek and jowl, to kind of open up the spaces between them. You have this beautiful expression of the actual terracotta on the outside. So this is very quickly shows you the two towers as they are. The actual red is the movement of the actual judges, as you can see, directly into the courthouse. The blue is the movement of the accused. So they have a completely, an isolated, vertical, movement, and then another core for the public, or for people who are actually coming here in a certain sense to kind of fight a court case or whatever that may be. The yellow is, of course, all the common spaces, and the beige is really the areas, the large terraces that you have. I mean, going to court is not a pleasant experience for anyone. So if you could have a little bit of greenery and a little bit of openness and a place to rest, was really what we wanted to do, to create these kind of urban, these gardens, so to speak, at all of these different levels. So here you can see the kind of connections between the two towers. The entire rear tower is very simple. It's just a very simple grid, which expands and contracts depending upon the kind of program at the back, whether it services or not. From a structural perspective as well, these two towers together actually work extremely well, because they actually support one another. This also just shows you where the air conditioning line is, the actual the bits that are air conditioned, the bits that are not. So these are the large foyers which you walk into on every floor. And of course, we did an audit of the actual energy footprint. We were looking at water harvesting on the platforms, because you would get a lot of rain kind of coming in. So rather than all of that just being drained away, could we actually kind of collect that and bring that back into the primary kind of the actual water system. So these are those large open terraces that you have at every level, which allows people to come and kind of take a break in the middle of, which could be contentious proceedings. Just some more images of the building, and the courtroom itself, again, very modern. This kind of timber cladding on the walls, and then we have this articulated roof, which glows. This is the building as it was recently finished. Yeah, and you can see the kind of columns on the outside are all structural, so you by and large you don't have too much structure on the actual inside. The building at night. And these are the terracotta panels and some of the large display windows and some of the interiors of the courtrooms themselves. Okay, just I'll try and end up. I'll try and wrap up after these two projects. So this was our first luxury residential project in basically Bombay, and this client came to us, and it's a very small plot on a very, very prime location. And, it is essentially Carmichael Road, which is probably one of the old Art Deco precincts in basically Bombay. So while the houses are all listed, this particular site was not. So of course, with basically much trepidation, we agreed to build a 15-story tower in a predominantly low-rise, historically important, relevant site within Bombay. So in a sense, I think one of the ideas really was that how do you bring this kind of Art Deco history, but also this idea of, as Korea said, form follows climate, a tropical tower, which essentially means, once again, lots of cross ventilation through the building, large balconies where one could enjoy, nice weather, when you have it. So those, in a certain sense, became kind of primary form givers. So because the site is actually like an actual quadrant, what you see is, four bull-nosed bars that rise up. Each floor is one flat. So you have the master bedroom on the left, then you have the living room, the dining room, and the kitchen. And the bullnose, again, is this kind of streamlined form that you see in kind of Art Deco, but kind of reimagined by us to create a very, very sinuous, a silhouette, to the building itself. There's a large parking podium that we wanted to hide. But what's interesting is that the building it's not straight. It actually bends outward as it gets higher. So you have the largest flats are at the higher level and the smallest flats are the below, following real estate, so to speak. So this is just a podium level plan. We have the kind of amenity floor with all the shared kind of facilities with the pool. But what's interesting really is the floor plan itself. So as you can see, these four bars, they kind of are staggered outward, taking on the shape of the side below. But as you enter, you have a lot of large voids, which allow the movement of air through the plan and the penetration of light. So although it's a fairly deep plan, there's an immense amount of light. And I think that's what really feels nice, especially also with the large balconies that we have, to the living room as well as, for the dining room. And in a certain sense, it's just like Bombay high life to kind of enjoy those moments that the actual plan offers you. What's also interesting is that, to bring back the chhaja or the overhang, which was again a kind of pervasive piece of kind of colonial architecture, but you see it everywhere. The lowly chhaja was kind of reimagined as this very beautiful articulated aluminum screen that kind of hangs over all the roofs. Because honestly, in India, nothing works better to keep the rain and light out or the glare out than a chhaja. And essentially that became one of the key elements in the building, which are all in this kind of charcoal aluminum. But the entire building is clad in glazed ceramic. And I guess one of the reasons also is that buildings in Bombay don't age well, just simply because of the moisture, dampness, rain, monsoon. So we have this beautiful, this glazed ceramic on the entire building. And, every monsoon, the building just kind of cleans itself, right? It just, all of it actually washes off. And again, the cladding itself is very delicately fluted, as a way to, again, kind of call on, that kind of Art Deco history. The podium is, as you can see, very heavily forested or landscaped, because we wanted it to kind of disappear. But you can see how the chhajas work, and on the podium, although it's a very tight site, but we still have meaningful pockets for all the community spaces that there are, in the building itself. Even little spaces, 3.5 meters that we got for the pool are made meaningful, by, you're putting in the pool there, but constantly using landscaping to shield views from all the neighboring plots. Again, just some more views of the amenities floor. And on Carmichael Road, we had 3 floors of parking, and you didn't want to express the parking podium, so we simply drew the elevation of the flats above all the way down to the ground floor, in a sense almost domesticating what would otherwise be a very harsh basically parking level. So you have a very large open or a double height space that you kind of walk into, and this leads into the main entrance foyer. Here are the, those voids that you saw at the amenities floor. They become these common spaces where people can kind of hang out and, enjoy a lot of the common amenities, the facilities that you have at this level. So some more views of, what those spaces kind of look like. So always large windows which are shaded, a lot of light, a lot of ventilation, ability to open this up. So this is a visualization of what the floor plan would actually look like. So, nice, deep, long living spaces allowing, dual arrangements. We're learning these new terms in real estate. So you have two living spaces, not one. On the left-hand side, which you can't see, is where we have the dining area. But again, lots of light, lots of air, these big, generous balconies, and these large open glass facades, of course, of the main bedrooms, which kind of, look outward. That's the kitchen. Again, with a lot of light, a lot of air. Normally most kitchens in real estate projects, barely have a small, 3 foot by 5 foot window. But again, this the generosity of light, the generosity of air. And this is the building that's up right now. On the right, on the left side is the glazed ceramic, which is actually, it's crackled. It's glazed crackled ceramic. It took a lot of work to kind of, get this, and this is all kind of bespoke. So yes, this project should also be done by the end of the year. So I'll just end on a very sweet project. This was something we did in Washington, D.C. about 5 years ago. We were given about 200 square meters in the Kennedy Center in Washington because there was a Maximum India Festival. And we had just finished another club, and we were called in to kind of dress this space up. And again, you're kind of talking about, music, Indian, basically Indian musicians, traditional musicians. So this idea of the Shamiana, right? I mean, you see Akbar there with, this beautiful, woven dhari, right? Which they essentially used to create kind of temporary shade. So that's what we did. We just created this dhari, which is made out of almost like this unraveling loom, over 1 million thread suspended from the ceiling, undulating to just create, in a sense, a shamiana over the performers. And, of course, it was only up for about 3 weeks, and then it was, all taken down. So, yeah. Okay, thank you.